listening to the Futures Podcast with me, Luke Robert Mason. On this episode, I speak to writer and musician Grafton Tanner.
Culture essentially freezes because these old ideas don't go away. They don't die out to be replaced by new ones.
Grafton shared his insights into how nostalgia is leveraged by big tech and corporations, how fictional universe building has impacted the way we think about lived reality, and how our recent obsession with the past might stop us from imagining a better future. You can view a full video version of this conversation at futurespodcast.net. Now, as British musical comedian Mitch Benn once sung, everything sounds like Coldplay now. Indeed, the presence of rampant nostalgia in today's digital media environment means that nothing feels new, with the internet essentially allowing us to participate in a form of on-demand, time-based tourism. Frighteningly devoid of its own aesthetics, big tech has borrowed feverishly from the cultures of a time before its own existence, and the result is oddly familiar, but also troublingly alien. In his new book, The Circle of the Snake, Grafton Tanner exposes how pop culture propagates and tech companies generate these nostalgic feedback loops. And in doing so, he uncovers how they keep us always on and always consuming. So, Grafton, what is nostalgia and how does it reveal itself in culture and through the media that we consume?
When we think about nostalgia, I think we think of a cultural kind of phenomenon where it's something that we associate with old dated movies, retro songs, maybe old styles coming back in style, remakes, sequels, prequels, all of that. You know, I think that's what we normally associate with, or like this new TV show out called WandaVision that is like this Marvel Cinematic Universe nostalgic kind of trip. But it's important to remember that nostalgia is an emotion. It's like first and foremost something that we, feel, in our bodies, and that it can scale up like any other emotion, like anger, for example, to a cultural level. That content creators and filmmakers and what have you, they can induce any kind of emotion they want in their narratives, whether that's sadness or anger, or it could be nostalgia. It just so happens that there's a lot of nostalgia in culture today, and there happens to be a lot of nostalgia in human bodies today, especially if we want to think about like the most recent, you may call it like outbreak of nostalgia coinciding with the outbreak of like COVID-19, where people are yearning for the time before lockdowns and when life seemed to be much more normal than it is now. But it is first and foremost an emotion. Whether or not it's a basic human emotion, whether or not it's something that we've always felt all the way back to the very beginning of human time, that's harder to say. But at the same time, it doesn't mean that it's entirely an invention, because like most emotions, they change with certain contexts. New emotions get felt in new contexts depending on the time or the culture that you live in. Some cultures recognize certain emotions, others don't. It just so happens that nostalgia doesn't really show up in the literature, in the world, until about the late 1600s. And then over time, it goes from being this disease that people thought at the time that needed like some kind of medical cure to being an incurable state of being or in a kind of emotion, for example. And now it's something that everybody sort of knows when they feel it. They could see it in culture. They could see it in politics even. But there's still no total consensus on exactly what it is.
So how, and I guess why, did nostalgia become so pervasive in our modern media?
There's a number of reasons for this. And I think we could start with probably the most basic reason, which is that for a few decades now, marketing researchers and consumer scientists have known that nostalgia sells things pretty well. That if you can market a product by inducing nostalgia, like you have a can of Coke and it's got like an old, an older looking Coke label on it, maybe one from a few decades ago, you're more likely to sell Coke than if you didn't induce it, or maybe if you induced a different emotion. And so that's sort of the first thing, is that nostalgia attracts your attention. And so from there, if a marketing company, advertising company, or even just like, big budget filmmaker can get your attention, then of course it's going to drive profits.
I mean, the problem, though, is that the form of nostalgia that we get is kind of a warped version of the past. And you even say in the book that the culture industry has much to gain from promoting shades of the past that appeal to intolerant impulses. So how has the past been rewritten, and I guess how has it been weaponized against us? Because it feels like this nostalgia is a deliberate form of misremembering of the past. It's a way to make the past almost, I guess, more appealing.
Yeah, absolutely. And for this, I like to draw on the scholar Svetlana Boym, who wrote The Future of Nostalgia in like early 2000, like I think maybe like 2000, 2001. And, she split nostalgia into two different kinds of variations. There was restorative nostalgia and reflective, which is kind of like the bad kind of nostalgia and the good kind of nostalgia. And so it's not necessarily that the emotion is wholly, essentially backwards and bad. It's just that you can utilize it in certain ways to support interests that maybe aren't so good. So the point isn't necessarily to suppress all nostalgic tendencies and stare into the future because we shouldn't ever yearn and look at the past. We're going to do that anyway. I think that's sort of a human condition. The point instead is not to suppress it, but to kind of redirect its flows in a way that maybe isn't so bad. But over the past few decades, I think what we've seen is a rise of that restorative kind, which Boym said was the kind of nostalgia that's more interested in getting back to like some kind of origin point in the past, the kind that's more interested in trying to revive the past no matter what that past might look like. It's the kind of nostalgia that's usually grouped together with like the rhetoric of the homeland. These people who are nostalgic in a restorative sense yearn for, they may feel there's been like a grand conspiracy that has separated them from the home and they've got to get back there to it. So it's a very reactionary kind of nostalgia. And the reflective kind is less so. It's a little more playful, perhaps even ironic. It's like if I wanted to wear a t-shirt with an old logo on it, I'm not really being serious about getting back to when the old logo was around. It's more just kind of like a playful, ironic thing that I'm doing to say, look how far we've come. This used to be popular and now I'm wearing it, it's almost like a joke maybe. That kind of nostalgia, does well like Urban Outfitters, like Urban Outfitters of the early 2010s and even still to this day to an extent. But the restorative kind helps to drive politics and helps you to, teaches you to buy certain things, because restorative nostalgia says there's this thing we got to get back to in the past. And if you endorse me as a candidate or if you buy this product, then we can get back there.
I think the best example of where we've seen that express itself in politics is in the phrase, "Make America Great Again." I mean, that's probably the greatest example that we have of a desire to turn towards some form of nostalgia. And it's smart because Trump never defined when America was great. He allowed the aesthetics to be placed onto that phrase by its audience. Every person in America has a slightly different idea of when they believe America was great. And really what a phrase like that tries to do is, I guess, create some sort of a consistent ideology of what America is and was and thus could be. But also it really just warps this whole concept of America, doesn't it?
Yeah, and you're absolutely right. That was Trump's weird strength, was not literally pointing to a time when America was last great. It became this kind of subtext. What ended up happening was his supporters filled in the gaps. They came up with their own idea of when America was last great. And if you take a moment to like go through YouTube and look up the genre of music called Trump wave, which is a electronic genre of music that takes like clips of Trump speeches and images from Trump on the campaign trail and back when he was president, and sort of intercuts them, or I should say pairs them with this kind of retro wave, synth wave, 80s throwback kind of music. That's them essentially taking the subtext and making it text, because those videos have images of everything from 1980s MTV, old Simpsons episodes, but also images of Hulk Hogan and wrestling from back in the day. But they're intercut with these images of people crossing the border and protests, as if to say, we got to get back there to the older times. And Trump is the one to do that because so much has gone wrong. I recommend looking them up because they're kind of frightening, and that's exactly what his base did, was to fill in the gaps.
I mean, the reason why we desire sort of a return to back then, as you just said it there, is because it feels like at least back then there was kind of a coherent narrative. I guess that's, again, Trump's power. He was creating this chaos. He was reveling in the destruction of narrative, and at the same time promising a return to coherent narrative. Something it feels like we've lost through our digital media environments.
Yeah, and to some extent, we as sense-making humans, we like to punctuate events to past events in order to make sense of them, turn them into a kind of a narrative or a story, and so in doing so, there's always this kind of tendency when looking back to see things a lot more structured than maybe they really were. Now, two people can punctuate differently. You have, of course, wide groups of people who looked back into recent history in the West and saw intolerance and all kinds of mass marginalization of groups of people. And then the other people, who perhaps are the ones who are supporting Trump, punctuate very differently, and they see a past that is one where there wasn't all these evils that they think, identity politics or things like this that they're really afraid of. And so and that's one of the tricky things about nostalgia, and it just so happens that it has recently been far more weaponized by the right in ways that might not align with democracy.
It felt during that Trump era, we were treating America, or at least Trump and media was treating America as sort of some form of cinematic universe where they were trying to ad hoc rewrite the entirety of its history to then sell it back to the world in a funny sort of way. As a Brit, I've always seen America through the lens of 80s movies, I guess. I mean, Spielberg is the reason I've always loved America. But again, the Spielberg vision of America is only a very mediated, very small version of what it is and potentially what it could be. I'm
fascinated by the universe building of Marvel and Disney and whatnot. There's a few reasons why I think that's very popular. I do think that universe building functions as a kind of and bear with me here. I think it functions as a kind of proto virtual reality because it allows us to construct these very finely detailed worlds in which we can, inhabit in the sense of watching them, but also, they have their own politics and their own backstories I just mentioned WandaVision earlier. I was trying to read a review of it, and there are the reviews that talk a lot about how it treats nostalgia and whatnot, but then there are those reviews that focus more on the Marvel Cinematic Universe, and I admit that I don't know that canon so well, and so I'm reading it totally confused. This is a different world. But for the people who like that stuff, they're able to almost live within it to a certain extent. And I think that scaled to the broader society, it has something to do with this. Not only gamification or virtualization of media and narratives, but also kind of a gamification of just life and politics, where it's something that that you can, that's not rooted in any kind of like real truth, and it is instead something you could sort of build to fit your own story, perhaps your own narrative. And if you get enough people to do that together, then I think you end up with something like QAnon, or these conspiracy theories that are not rooted in reality whatsoever, but are instead rooted in a shared belief that reality can be sort of built and controlled in a certain way to inhabit, almost as you would like a game.
You look at how Disney sort of handles Marvel and Star Wars as a property. I mean, the fans come up with fan fiction which essentially bleeds back into those realities, that they've forced the creators of some of these properties to actually do fan service. I think one of the characters in the new Star Wars Mandalorian series, the fans wanted a certain actor to portray one of the new Jedi characters, and what they managed to do there was create enough sort of libidimal energy in this reality to affect another reality. It is kind of a weird. I mean, I'm quite shamelessly, I'm a bit of a Star Wars fan, and it goes back to the fact that that's where my childhood lived. You know, in 1999, Star Wars Episode 1 came out, and to me, as a 10, 11-year-old kid, I mean, that was so new and so exciting to me. And when I see things like The Mandalorian reappear on our screens, I'm hark back to that time as a child. I've openly tweeted, oh God, I feel like a 12-year-old again every time I watch Luke Skywalker appear with a lightsaber inside the Star Wars universe. I just don't know what this media is doing to me, but I know I feel that feeling. You kind of get very hopeless. You kind of relinquish yourself to these realities. You want to live inside of them for a little while, and I wonder if that's just escapism or if there's something else going on there.
I think escapism is a part of it, absolutely, and people want an escape. I mean that's sort of the part of the plot of the film Ready Player One, which is that you've got this future world that's totally collapsed, and the only way that people can get by is by escaping into the Oasis game and just messing around with the safe pop cultural markers of the previous decades. And so there's definitely an element of escapism there. And look, there's nothing necessarily wrong about escaping, because people, I think, need that escape, absolutely. But there's always we don't want to lose you forever. We want you to come back. You don't have to go away forever and escape. The point is to return, and maybe tell us what you've learned in your escape. I do think so. I just finished up a manuscript for a whole book on the politics of nostalgia, just tight focused about nostalgia in the 21st century. It'll be out later this year. I have a chapter on escape. I also have a section about what I call the nostalgia industry, which is kind of like the culture industry, but one that's more like Disney, Marvel, Lucasfilm, that's interested in churning out these nostalgic stories. One of the reasons why Disney is, as Henry Giroux calls it, the nostalgia machine, par excellence, is because Disney has consistently for years and years lobbied to keep all of their works out of the public domain, so that they can keep the copyright on everything from Mickey Mouse forward. In doing so, they continually create, after buying Star Wars, after buying Lucasfilm and having those rights to make Star Wars films, more Star Wars movies, more Marvel movies, and all of this, because they know it's going to sell, and because they know that stuff's never going to it's never going to go out of copyright. It's always going to be something they can use to sell and build their universes more and make more money, build their franchises even more. But the effect of this is that culture essentially freezes, because these old ideas don't go away. They don't die out to be replaced by new ones, and they're not ever going to, as long as Disney continues to lobby for copyright extensions. And the reason why they're able to do that is because they're Disney and they're huge, So this sort of process of not just consolidation, where these mega corporations buy each other up, but also the process of extending that copyright means that there just isn't a lot of new and diverse voices and ideas. Instead, they're kind of all being edged out by the same things: Star Wars, Marvel, and Disney.
I struggle with the Marvel universe because you want to look at these sorts of highly popular media and see how they comment on current society. And the Marvel Cinematic Universe, as you said with WandaVision, is starting to play with the idea of alternative realities, quantum time, the possibility of time travel. And when I first saw that, I thought, wow, they're understanding how we're moving towards understanding of reality in the quantum sense, and they're representing that on the screen and making us feel more comfortable about the possibility of there being a multitude of possibilities and a multitude of worlds in which we could live. And then the more I thought about it, I realized, well, in actual fact, it might not be a comment on the latest understanding of physics. What it might actually be is just a idealized example of perfect corporate synergy. If you can create multiple worlds, then you can create multiple strands of the same story. And even Marvel now is doing something called What If, where they basically take all the stories they've already told and then slightly change things about them so they can retell them again. So it's nothing to do with an understanding of how we're moving from a linear understanding of time to a quantum understanding of time. It's everything to do with corporate synergy, and that's the sad thing about it.
I have not heard of this. What if they'll change like certain things of the stories and repackage them?
So they're basically using the source material and then changing small bits about it to basically milk more IP from the original symbol of the superhero character that they have access to. But yeah, and I agree, WandaVision is I guess a kind of oddly self-referential version of that, because and I assume you've seen the first couple of episodes. I mean, the first couple of episodes are nonsensical. They're set in a 60s TV show. You're sitting there expecting superheroes, and it's not until about, no spoiler alerts here, but it's not until about the third or fourth episode do they finally kind of create the bleed between the outside world and this fictional TV world that's being created, we don't know yet, but being created by what seems to be the main characters. So there just seems to be this odd playfulness that's happening that we are passive observers to. On reading your book, it made me more critical about how Disney operates with their IP.
And that playfulness, it attracts attention. It allows them to. I mean, they could play with their published works as much as they want, because, like I said, they've got firm copyright hold on them, and so yeah, at first glance, it's like, wow, how self-referential and meta, and that's kind of cool and far more interesting than just sort of blatant spoon-fed freebase nostalgia or something, but. Yeah, it's all in service to their profits. Essentially them trying to get you to watch it by any means necessary. And I think this is part of the reason why Easter egg marketing is so effective, is that people tend to, like I said, be attracted to the things that they're able to recognize, and so and that also becomes sort of a process of gamifying. Culture and media is the act of watching then becomes not necessarily something about keeping up with the plot line or understanding deeper themes or character motivation or whatever it is that we do when we consume narratives and stories, but instead is more about like trying to hunt the references in order to tally them and see how many you can. So it's like a citational almost like practice of consuming, but ultimately. It serves them really well. It serves a company like Disney really well because, they know it's going to do well.
And I wonder whether that citational way of watching large popular media has bled back into real life. I mean, it really does feel like the QAnon thing, doesn't it? I mean, you look for any clue within reality to be able to generate the narrative that points back at the assumption that you had. The spoilers are in the little cues, the referential cues that you can notice in reality, and that's how these weird conspiracy theories almost begin.
Yeah, I was just talking to somebody the other day and talking about like I don't know, maybe like Trumpism as a kind of ideology that operates that very same way, some like an ideology that went viral or something, and that people believe because it is kind of like a game. So conspiracies are like that, but even just, I mean, just existing in the world. And if you happen to, leave your house, I mean, now it's, we're in the pandemic or whatnot, but like being able to go down the road and see, signage, billboards, brick and mortar stores. I mean, nostalgia is not even just in the narratives we consume on Netflix or something or Disney Plus, but it's literally everywhere. And so even in the real world, there's always this spotting the reference that we tend to be doing, spotting the references that we tend to do, even just existing in the world. And so it's really hard to escape that kind of Easter egging of just, reality, even beyond the media that we consume.
I mean, the key to your book really is about nostalgia's relationship with big tech and media corporations. So, I mean, how do the big tech companies, how do they keep us locked inside of this nostalgia trap using algorithmic analysis and all sorts of never-ending feedback loops?
There's a few ways that I see nostalgia kind of being generated out of our relationship to big tech and the devices that we use. I mean, being a social media user and being tethered to certain devices like iPhones or whatnot, it kind of keeps you always on. You're always doing this sort of immaterial labor of branding and networking and whatnot. And that is kind of a breeding ground for nostalgia, because there's always this yearning to like throw the phone down and get off. So we were just talking, about trying to get off social media and leave all that behind, because you're kind of always working and hustling, and there's no sort of rootingness to it. You're constantly, having to essentially sell yourself, and that can be very stressful on a person, and therefore nostalgia tends to come with that. There's also the fact that the internet is itself a giant archive, and that you could pretty much look up anything from your past that you want to. It could be, things from your childhood. Like I did this sort of experiment on myself where I followed this account on Instagram that just posts like once a day these images of old Lego sets from like the 80s and 90s. And it is literally a hit of nostalgia every time I go on there and see. I'm not even like looking for it. I just check my Instagram and there it is. And so being able to look up anything and find anything from your past, old TV shows, old random commercials that only aired a few times, but you saw them enough a few decades ago to remember them. And so watching them again, you feel nostalgic for that time. That's kind of like how the internet sort of works. But in terms of the algorithms that we sort of interact with all the time when we're online, there's been a lot of great work on algorithmic bias. Safiya Noble is one of them. She wrote Algorithms of Oppression, in which she writes about the biases of these people who create the algorithms, and the computer scientists and coders or whatnot end up sort of encoding their biases in things like Google search, for example. But then you have people like Catherine Stinson, who is a researcher looking at what happens with culture when how we come across new cultural ideas is by essentially an algorithm recommending it to us. What happens then? And she writes about how that leads to sort of a general homogenization of ideas, because the algorithm is only going to recommend what it thinks you like, and what it thinks you like is what you've previously looked up or consumed before. And so what it recommends is itself sort of a derivative of that. So algorithmic feedback loops work by recommending things to you that you already know that you like, or maybe you already tell them, the algorithm that you like. And it just so happens that if that happens to be like a piece of nostalgia, like if you happen to want to watch Saved by the Bell or something because you're super nostalgic or whatnot, then of course the algorithm is just going to see that and just keep giving you nostalgia over and over again, even if you didn't want it.
I mean, all of this, Grafton, all of this feels like it started at a particular time, and you point towards perhaps two moments that began our nostalgic turn, and that's the shit sandwich that is 9/11 in 2001 and the recession in 2008. So what is it about those moments in history and culture that made nostalgia so appealing to us?
I like to start at 9/11 because it's a time, it ushered in sort of the 21st century, but it also ushered in a particular kind of like nationalistic nostalgia in response to what Robert J. Lifton has called futurelessness, which is this mass belief among people that anything is possible now that we know that people can fly planes into buildings. And so he writes that in the aftermath of 9/11, there's this feeling of like deep despair, but not just any kind of despair, but a despair that the future could only be more horrible now that we know this, because we can never truly be safe. And it's also expounded by the then going to war. And now not only are you worried about random acts of terrorism, but now we're at war, and will the war come home to the homeland and all of this? And so that sort of futurelessness that he writes about, I argue that nostalgia tends to be a like almost a way to ward that off, by settling instead and rooting oneself into these familiar, perhaps even patriotic ideas of the past and the homeland, and then therefore feeling more safe. After 2008, my generation, for example, like going out of college or whatnot and not having work and no jobs and feeling pretty much like knocked out at the knees, moving back in with their parents, something that's happening right now, again, in the pandemic, but also starting to consume nostalgic content around this time using some of these, algorithmic, recommender things that are starting to come more mainstream around that time. And so, if you're out of a job because of a recession and you move back in with your parents and you start binging a bunch of nostalgic media, something that people have been doing at least for the past year especially, but also, right after the recession for years after 2008, then what you're going to be recommended is more of that nostalgic content, thus trapping you almost in this kind of nostalgic consumption loop.
Yeah, when you mentioned 2001, 2008 being so prevalent, I did have to think, what do I remember from that moment? So I was in my teens. You were in your teens as well. We were 11 or 12 years old to about 18 years old. I can't confidently point at anything that denotes that era. It feels like there's a physical gap in my memory. It's weird to me that I can't point at a single cultural moment between those times. And maybe it's just a factor of my age and that I was in my teens and that wasn't something I was particularly looking for. Or perhaps we just did have this beginning of the end of cultural creation, a slip away from the new and into this nostalgic period.
Yeah, I feel kind of similarly. I think my memory of it is that there was a lot of fear and anxiety, and it was like the beginning of like a mass, constant, ambient kind of anxiety that has only seemed to just increase with each new crisis. But there was also a lot of push to get people to not only go fight these wars in the aftermath of 9/11, the war on terror, but also for everybody to sort of come together and support it, to unify the audience of the United States especially, but the West, to support this cause. And in the book that I have coming out later this year about nostalgia, I write about the creation of the Department of Homeland Security as a way to sort of codify nostalgia in, almost like in society, to say that, to secure the homeland is itself a nostalgic kind of impulse, because when people feel that feeling, what they yearn for is the safety of home. And it's different because home isn't necessarily a place we can go to now. That would cure homesickness. But nostalgia is a home that kind of, exists somewhere in the past that we really can't get back to. And hence there's that feeling. And to to refer to the United States as the homeland, which is something that had been done before, but to literally make a department out of it. Now suddenly there's this feeling where this place is sacred and it's our origin point, and if we aren't careful, it's going to be under attack. Thus, we lose it all, and so there's this sort of constant nostalgia for the homeland that is already always at risk of being lost. And I think that's something that is, in my mind, one of the major long-lasting effects of 9/11 is this terror of losing the origin point, which is the United States. And this is now being written about a little bit more widely, especially in the wake of all the protests that happened under Trump in 2020. People were writing about how the war came home. It was like the war finally is in the United States after so many years of it being over there. Now it's here, and we're like almost at war with each other. Yeah, it's this feeling that that we have to hold on to this thing called the homeland, and that if you aren't nostalgic for it, then the DHS is going to send its boots after you and force you to be nostalgic for it.
I think I really misunderestimated the long-term psychological impact of 9/11 on our generation, and it didn't become real to me because, of course, I'm British, and the way I saw it was 11 years old on a TV, on a square TV at that, and it didn't hit home to me till I was in New York, and I got into an Uber cab at JFK, and I get in the back of the Uber cab, and the Uber driver goes, "Man, where you flown from?" I go, "Well, I came from London." He goes, "How long is that, dude?" I go, "It's about an 8-hour flight." He goes, "Man, I can't fly." I go, "What do you mean?" He goes, "I can't fly, man. I'm probably your age. I'm about, 30 odd years old. I can't fly." I go, "Why?" He goes, "I saw those planes go into those buildings on TV. And ever since then, man, I've been scared of flying. I won't step on a plane." And it was at that moment, it kind of became obvious to me that has had such a scar on our generation, I guess.
Mm. Yeah, I haven't flown in a while because of the pandemic, but I think about it every time, I get in a plane, and there are plenty of crises that predate 9/11 that help to unleash nostalgia. It does seem like for longer than even just the past 20 years, for well through the last century, even each new major kind of event just sort of unleash nostalgia on a wider scale, or at least, once it starts to die down, suddenly the next major crisis happens, and then it spreads it once again. And so we're living through that now, I feel like the major crisis events are getting they're starting to come one after the other a little more quickly. I regard Trump's 4 years in office as one of these events, to one of the kinds of nostalgia, not just the one that the kind that he induced, but also the nostalgia for the Obama era. You have a number of people on the left who voted for Joe Biden because they felt like he could bring us back to that origin point, back to that safe point, when in fact, of course, we know the time before Trump wasn't very safe at all. It wasn't like some utopia by any stretch of the imagination. And now we're in yet another, perhaps more powerful, maybe even one to rival the nostalgia outbreak of 9/11, which is the COVID-19 pandemic, where just a week into the at least in the U.S., a week into the lockdowns, and the number of these articles were being written about people binging nostalgic media to try to get through it, and so I think we're living through a major moment where that emotion is very high.
Oh, I wonder if it wasn't for the internet and if it wasn't for this nostalgic media, if we would ever make it through the COVID-19 crisis. We've been going through this for almost a year now. We've been in and out in lockdown in the UK for pretty much a year. February 2020 sort of marks the beginning of when we were slipping into lockdown, and it's February 2021 now. But that time's passed so quickly. And I wonder if there is a weird effect that nostalgia and the web and how media is presented in this format messes with memory.
I think it definitely does. It definitely messes with your sense of temporality, of knowing, of being able to experience time. I think of the 2010s as sort of the moment when, I mean, I think even Doug Rushkoff said this, that they were kind of post-temporal, like there was no, it didn't feel like the time passed as it normally would in the 2010s. And there were also writers who were coming out with articles at the end of the 2010s saying the exact same thing, like it felt like they didn't happen or whatnot. And I think some of this has to do with the way that we consume content and media, and by extension, the way that we consume events and then understand them as well. And so the sense of time passing over the past year, especially in 2020 during the pandemic, that sense of time passing is very different for different people. And I think in one way it could feel like it has gone on forever. And then in another way, like you say, it doesn't seem like it's been a year at all. I mean, I think about over the summer, feeling like that didn't exist in 2020. Like, I don't know what it was, but my summer experience seemed to be a different year. And that I went from lockdown in March and April to like September, I'm not really sure what that means, but I think that consuming nostalgic things at the very least can help you get through really bad times. How that changes your sense of time, I think, depends on how much of maybe the media that you do consume, because I think for so many people over the past year, there just doesn't seem to be a regular beginning, middle, and end. And some of this also has to do with the fact that there isn't really an end yet to the pandemic.
I mean, it's not just about how media is consumed, but it's how it's represented, how it's captured and represented. And as I was reading your book and as I'm listening to you now, I can't help but remember Douglas Copeland, the author, the science fiction author, who in 2012 had a presentation at the Serpentine Gallery where he jokingly talked about this idea of 9-tenicillin, a magical pill, a magical drug that you can take that makes you think 9/11 never happened. And the reason he kind of proffered this idea was if you actually look at the footage from that day, everyone's hair and everyone's clothing looks oddly familiar. It's been almost 20 years, but the aesthetics, the fashion hasn't really changed much. And the only thing that seems odd, apart from the fact that all the footage from that moment is in 4:3, is that nobody's standing on the street pointing their phone at the sky as it's happening. And he argues, look, that means two things. Either 9/11 was the last top-down mediated event in global history. It's the last global event where you and I and everybody across the globe would have seen, I think it was like 6 or 7 camera angles of those planes hitting the buildings. I mean, that's all we have, and that becomes burned into our retina. And what we could actually end up seeing 9/11 as is possibly the last under-documented event in history, because there wasn't people there who were able to point their phones at the sky. I just wonder how all of that changes our memories of these events. The fact that, look, we are not the people who are mediating these events at that point in time, but we are now.
That's interesting because even when it happened, it was considered a major media spectacle. And of course, now we know that, as you say, it's really, compared to the dizzying amount of information we can record at any given time, all of us who have access to phones and whatnot, it does seem very under-mediated by comparison. I do think that over-mediation leads to a kind of amnesia, that there doesn't seem to be, it leads to not a very well-established, coherent understanding of something. I think that's one of the reasons why it feels like the 2010s didn't really happen, is because there was such a gathering, info glut is what Mark Andreevich calls it, but just it almost kind of like kept gathering and gathering, where each of us is, kind of recording our own ideas and our own realities. And there's just so much information, no one could ever collate it into some kind of meaningful, beginning, middle, and end. I think there has to be maybe a slight bit of undermediation in order to make sense of certain things.
But Grafton, do you think America is even capable of doing under mediation. You know, the thing about 9/11 that really struck me was in 2012, which was the first time I ever visited New York. I went to go see, then at the time, the 9/11 memorial. And in 2012, the thing was still being built. The Freedom Tower hadn't been built yet. And I had to go through this kind of faux airport-style security to even be let on the grounds to go and see the fountains, the infinity fountains that they have there. And you arrive, and the infinity fountains are built verbatim on the grounds of the buildings. These two massive squares that represent exactly where the towers were. And as you get closer to these memorials, they have, around the outside, they have the names written, and you see all the names of the people who had died. But the thing that was most striking to me was the sound. As you get closer to these infinity fountains, what you hear is, which oddly enough is also the sound of buildings in free fall. So it's like they've mediated the actual collapse, the actual tragedy itself, and then have fixed it and are constantly representing that. And I didn't realize what sort of psychological impact that might have until I went to the Holocaust Memorial in Berlin a couple of years later. And the Holocaust Memorial is an entirely different visceral experience. You go there, and it's these concrete pillars that are built amongst this very kind of uncomfortable stonework. So it's these cobbles that you have to walk through, and eventually as you walk through the memorial, these pillars sort of engulf you. They get larger and larger because the ground is dipping, and there's no names. There's no names of the folks who died, the Jews who died in the Holocaust. And you have this weird, uncomfortable, visceral response. You feel like something terrible has happened, or something terrible is happening, and you hear the echoes of other people in that space. It's not specifically trying to remediate what happened in the Holocaust. Obviously, that would be horrible to do. But then when you compare that to the 9/11 memorial and you're hearing the infinity fountains, you're like, why are they just focusing purely verbatim on the collapse? It feels like you're trying to force the eye and the ear back to that moment, back to that moment, back to that moment constantly. And I just wonder if that's just an American way of mediating memory. It's not possible to do what they've done in Europe with the Holocaust Memorial, just create a visceral feeling of something. Of course, you know, the Holocaust is not in most people's recent memories, so there has to be a different way of remembering.
Yeah, I had not thought about that. I think that's interesting. I mean, I think about, you know, if we talk about 9/11 as a kind of spectacle, then the memorial being itself, it's a kind of spectacle, you know, makes sense. And I think there's something to do with this. You talk about the 9 penicillin or whatever, you know, it has something to do with the way that we remember 9/11 having something to do the way we remember 9/10, you know, September 10th, everything before, even the ones who weren't even alive then. There's always this, you know, with these, you know, commemorations and whatnot of 9/11, there's this idea of like everything was calm and placid, and September 10th, everything was good, and then September 11th, it was like the world ended. In 2011, I think it was ABC News, they ran this thing called The Way We Were, in which they highlighted the major news stories of September 10th before the world changed forever, I think is what they say. And I think that's got something to do with that kind of memorial of, you know, something that's so spectacularly devastating and deadly that just occurs in an instant, and that just right before, it's a different world. Just the day before, a few hours before, on September 10th, it's like a foreign country. I want to say maybe there's something there with that.
Do you think we have and I have to be careful here, but do you think we have a weird desire for something that monumentous to happen again, to sort of shock us out of the current malaise that we're in? Is there an odd thirst for a media moment like that we can all share collectively? Because it feels like we no longer have any of these forms of grand narrative. I'm not saying that, by any means that I want another terrorist incident to occur, but I mean, what is it on a global scale that could occur that would sort of shock us into dealing finally with the new? It just feels like we're dealing with this trauma, and we're dealing with it by avoiding it, by going to the time before it even happened to escape the memory of it even happening.
Well, I think that there's some like post 9/11 cinema scholars who have talked about some of the disaster films and whatnot that came out in the wake of 9/11 as being sort of like a replaying of the grand, spectacular, explosive moment, traumatic moment, or whatever. I think about like films like The Day After Tomorrow, which I believe was. Yeah, that was post 9/11, and the Transformers films and whatnot, and these massive visual feasts of destruction that were really popular in the 2000s. And I think that serves as a kind of way to deal with and deal through to feel through, if you will, some of that initial shock of 9/11, to replay it over and over again as if to feel it once again for the first time, the sheer horror. I know that, shortly into the pandemic, COVID-19 pandemic, there, with like me and my friends, we're texting one another and calling, and it does seem to be like a galvanizing moment. Suddenly, maybe not the same kind of galvanizing moment you have after 9/11, which was one that was very much about reknitting a community under like the signs of patriotism, for example, and then therefore justifying, going to war. This was sort of like a collective, we're all in this together kind of feeling. And that eventually went away. And it went away for a number of reasons. One of those is, the wake of George Floyd's, public execution, essentially, that led to the protests of people who were already, like, one, stuck at home, two, many of them without jobs and whatnot, and feeling the weight of the pandemic a few months in, and then something horrific like that happens, and they hit the streets, rightfully so. But it feels like that it's, I think it's not going to take a giant, spectacular event, horrific event, to galvanize a lot of people in a way to then deal with 9/11. Instead, each event sort of just kind of plays off the one before it. The trauma only increases because it's kind of just so hard, at least in the United States, it's relatively difficult to live as just a regular working person. It's like, how many of my friends lost healthcare when they lost their jobs in the wake of the pandemic? How many of us are kind of burdened to some extent by student debt, which can be literally just eliminated tomorrow if our president wanted to do it? All of these things that just make it so difficult, so that when major national crises happen, you barely can survive.
Well, then that becomes a thing, that there's nothing to be nostalgic for. If we're jumping from terrible moment to terrible moment, there's not going to be a generation that looks back in COVID-19 and goes, oh, those were the good old days, Well, it depends, because that's the funny thing about nostalgia, is that a lot of times the good old, I think it was Phoebe Bridgers tweeted like, these better not be the good old days. And I replied, I was like, but I think they're probably going to be, because that's just, wow. That ends up, how usually how it happens. I mean, I was talking to someone else the other day about, kind of being slightly nostalgic for the early days, at least in the U.S., of lockdown, when they didn't really have to do anything. And the reason why they feel that is because, and I totally can see this in the United States, being forced back to work when maybe you don't want to, because the pandemic is still so bad and the numbers are still so high. Of course you would yearn for when you could just stay at home, if you were privileged enough to do that, and not have to risk your life going out and trying to work, while this thing's so bad. But nostalgia tends to misremember all parts of the past. It remains to be seen whether or not some of these recent things, like the COVID-19 pandemic, will be looked back at fondly. I'm just not sure. The interesting thing to me is not just how nostalgia allows us to canonize, say, media or canonize reality, but it's how it's forcing us in the present to canonize ourselves. So let me explain that a little more. We're essentially using social media to create a canon version of our own identity, to then represent that to the world and to fix everything, and fix, by which I mean hold in place everything that we are in the present. And I guess when you talk about nostalgia, the first social media platform most folks think of is Instagram, because Instagram originally was set up to create those little filters over those very low resolution images, so they would look very referential. They would look like little Polaroid square photographs, and it was this kind of very cute appeal to nostalgia. But what Instagram has morphed into with folks, with this whole new age of Instagram influencers, is something whereby it's no longer about nostalgia, but it's about creating fictional layers on top of nostalgia, creating whole new realities. Instagram influencers sit and they edit their photos ad infinitum and draw out certain colors, do these odd high dynamic range filters. They put fake stars into the sky. They put fake birds and fake clouds, fake lights. They're creating this utterly false rendering of the world, and all that ends up doing as someone who then has to sort of perceive that media is it just provokes a deep sadness. It provokes a deep sadness that we can't live there in the reality that they've created. So I guess my question is, how do platforms like Instagram lead to this very warped understanding of who we are and how we should canonize our lives?
Well, it's got a lot to do. I mean, you said fix, and really both meanings of the word, like not just solidify into place, but also to correct, for the future you to look back on. I mean, like, not just Photoshop, but just using the very basic editing softwares you can get on your phone before you upload, a photo. And so, and more than just editing, curating and selecting what you choose to put, online, and therefore it become a part of your feed or whatnot. You've got all these layers of kind of like, unreality that between the thing that you experienced and then what ends up showing up on Instagram when you go back to it. This is kind of like the main problem with photography in general, which is that it allows you to fix moments and look back at them and perhaps, feel that nostalgic rush a lot easier than if you just had to sit back and close your eyes and really try really hard to think about it. Now you just look and it's there, right? But being able to constantly document your life and curate it to make it look as good as you possibly can or as unreal and utopian as possible means that, that later on you're likely to look back and see that, fake world, if you will, on Instagram and yearn for it. And even being able to have that much information about yourself, that many images of yourself in the future, you will look back. You'll see how you used to look and what you used to do. I mean, look back on your feeds and look back before February 2020 and look at the way life used to, look. And I guarantee you'll feel a little bit of nostalgia, and that's something that's relatively new. Katie Eichhorn wrote this book called The End of Forgetting, in which she talks about growing up with social media and like being a young person and sort of becoming aware that your parents have, since the day you were conceived, put stuff about you online, including images of you when you were a kid and a baby and whatnot, and how that sort of causes the childhood to like always be there and follow you into the future when maybe it's something you need to like leave behind. And I'm trying to remember, I don't think she explicitly, she talks a little bit about nostalgia, but yeah, I mean, being able to look back at what maybe by the time you're 18 years old in this day and age is your entire life documented on something like Instagram does make it relatively difficult, I think, and I think she would agree, to sort of move into the future and leave some of that stuff behind and let that stuff be forgotten. That being said, that stuff can be forgotten. I mean, all you got to do is deactivate the account and that stuff is gone. You know, I mean, not like totally.
It's not even documentation, though, is it? It's remediation, because, I mean, the way I can look back on my childhood is I go to the loft or the cupboard under the stairs in my parents' house, and there's a biscuit tin of printed photos that allow me to sort of see myself as a child. But the moment at which you look at that photo, suddenly your memory changes. I remember less about my childhood by looking at those images, and remember more about the moments that were captured by looking at those images. So we've got to be really careful with what we capture and what we fix and then fixate on, because I do think it can have a real impact on sort of how we tell the narrative of our lives back to ourselves. And then the same sort of interest that you have about what happens to these kids who are born digital, whose parents had mediated their lives up until they're 18, and then in some sort of weird moment of digital bar mitzvah hand over the passwords to their accounts. I mean, surely the thing you'd want to do at that moment as any 18-year-old is just to delete everything, you know, get rid of everything, start again, be able to play your identity, you know, be your own person and not be fixed by the images of yourself that have been put on these platforms. And of course, as you write so beautifully in the book, what these platforms end up doing with images like that are analyzing them for cues that then can be used to sort of sell things back to us. So, you know, there's hundreds of photos of this kid sucking his thumb. Then we know that he's orally instead of anally retentive, so that's going to change the way in which advertisers then market to him. So there's almost a good reason to not put children into these platforms, not to mess with their memories by fixing them and then allowing them to fixate on how the parents have subjectively edited their identity.
Yeah, it's a strange problem, and it's a novel one. We're just now starting to. I think that's why her book is so great. Is that you know, she's sort of one of the first to really think about this problem and what it might mean for people who are coming of age and wanting to perhaps leave some parts of themselves behind that they should leave behind. And like I said, I mean, that is a problem, but there's also the problem of being able to get rid of that stuff pretty quickly. I mean, nothing ever really dies on the internet, you know, but if you wanted to get rid of, you know, all of that, you could just deactivate it and it's gone. And that itself is almost kind of an issue. Svetlana Boym was writing this in the early 2000s. She said, you know, I'm going to paraphrase it, but like, you know, on the internet, you've got these two options, either total memory recall by having all that stuff archived for you to see, or total disappearance and it's gone. And it's very tenuous. It's not like the you know, Under the Stairs with the photographs where, I mean, yeah, I guess I could throw those into the fire or whatever, but I cannot get rid of them or call them up as easily and quickly as I can get my phone out and scroll really fast and within seconds be in the past, or press a button and it's gone.
It's going to be difficult to navigate the relationship we have with information that we place in the cloud. Again, Douglas Copeland talks about this beautifully, and it's so prevalent for our moment right now. He talks about how if you want time to pass quickly, then just go on the internet. And it feels like in a COVID-19 environment where all that I do is spend time on a machine interacting, and there is no differentiation to my day with the exception of being able to do these podcast interviews. This moment has passed so quickly, and all of my memories are generated by my interactions with a shiny glowing rectangle sitting in front of me. And I guess, you know, that's a problem at this stage, but it could get worse if we start to escape completely into virtual realities of our own creation.
And I think that's one of the important things about escape, is that it's important to escape every so often to kind of like reorient yourself and to kind of get a different perspective. But there has to be like a return process, because mere escapism, like I think could be really dangerous, and wrenches people out of the world in ways that it might be really unproductive when they really need to just kind of get away for a little bit and then be able to come back and and give what they've learned perhaps back to the present. This is one of my I write about this in the book that's coming out later this year. One of my problems with people who are always trying to like go off the grid, people who are trying to escape to cabin in the woods kind of thing, is that it's a solution only for those people. There's no like there's it doesn't help society or the collective whatsoever, just by exiting society and being like, I'm out of here. That's a solution only for you. The guy Mark Boyle, who I think that's his name, who goes by like the term the moneyless man, who started to live without money like at the turn of the 2010s, and then ended up moving out to a cabin in the woods just without any technology whatsoever. He's written some books, of course, about this experience, but he did this interview like a few years back where he essentially admits like, yeah, I don't know anything about Brexit. I don't really understand. I don't really know. I'm able to, thankfully, I don't have to worry about that. And it's like, well, good for you. Good for you. That's one of the problems I have with escapism is that the pure total escape, I'm off the grid, see ya, that doesn't help anything. Nobody but you, basically.
But it doesn't have to be that pure, does it? I mean, there could just be an advantage of managing our relationship with digital technology, having, a dopamine break from these devices. And that doesn't necessarily need to be a privileged position. It's difficult when your job is so intimately tied to the use of shiny glowing rectangles. But if it's not, then why can't we begin to retreat away from the use of this social media? Is the dopamine kick just way too strong right now?
Recently, in the past few years, you've had a number of ex-Silicon Valley technocrat guys come out and argue for people to just put down the phones. This is what The Social Dilemma was about. It's those guys, the documentary The Social Dilemma.
Yeah, those guys.
Those guys, yeah. I got in a fight with them on Twitter a few months back. I feel really embarrassed about it. But yeah, they like put down the phone, like take a digital detox, put down the phone, whatever. And I teach college, and I often tell my students like take 6 months off of social media, just to see what it's like, and to also maybe give yourself a break. But then, just to experience what that might feel like. It's kind of, when I got off Facebook, it was a strange experience and kind of a cool experience, to be honest. Felt way more rooted in a way. But, at the same time, just this blanket statement to say, just put down your phones is a problem for a few reasons. One is that, as you say, not everybody can put down the phones. You got people who, rely on phones for their jobs. They got to work. I hate that that's the way it is, but you can't just put it down. Students, for example, constantly plugged into their phone, not just because they want to post on Instagram, but because they've got education apps that update constantly what their grade is, and they got to turn this stuff in. So they're very much tethered to their phones because they're students. And then also, just going off of social media might make you feel a little bit better, but it's still the structure of the main problems with big tech are still kind of there. You've still got people who, like content moderators, who are working these gigs that don't pay very well to go through the refuse that's posted online and seeing all this crazy stuff that they're tasked with monitoring. It's a horrible gig, and one that's been written about. You've got all these problems with tech that have to do with the environment, like how much water it takes to cool these data farms and everything. So yes, it's fine and good that I'm off, but like the problems are kind of still there.
And you're right. It's a very privileged position to be able to switch off, but it feels like what's at stake is our ability to look objectively at these platforms. When you're in it, when you're consuming it, when you're in many ways enjoying it, whether that's just the dopamine hit that you're getting constantly, or it's the fact that, it's another Star Wars thing and that's a wonderful form of escapism. It's very hard to turn away from it. And even in my own life. I had to literally be dragged kicking and screaming away from it, and by doing a Vipassana meditation retreat. And I signed up for this thing, and God knows why. And about a couple of days before I realized I had to do it, and my first thought was, there's so many emails that I still have to reply to. I don't have time to take 10 days out. But reluctantly, I got on the train and went out to do the Vipassana meditation. And basically, for anybody who doesn't know, Vipassana is 10 days of silent meditation, and the first part of that is locking away your devices, locking away your phones, locking away your electronics. And the anxiety I felt for the first couple of days of, I didn't inform so-and-so I was going away. I didn't inform, I didn't put an out of office email on. There's probably people emailing me wanting things, and I probably should have deactivated my social media because people are going to be worried that I've disappeared, and they can never reach me again. The reality was, of course, when I came back from the 10 days, no one cared. Like, there wasn't that trauma, there wasn't that anxiety. But the second thing I found during that process, and again, I was in a very privileged position to be able to even take 10 days out for myself to perform silent meditation. But one thing I realized was, by putting the phone away, I was finally able to have a train of thought. And that sounds odd, but every lunchtime you would go on these breaks. And during these breaks, about an hour long after lunch, you could walk around this small piece of grassland, and there's no thing to do. Yeah? In a weird sort of way, it sounds odd to say there's no thing to do, but all you do is you walk. And as you're walking, you're thinking. The crazy thing about silent meditation is silence is deafening, and all these thoughts rush to the head. And what you can't do is stop the thoughts from rushing to your head by turning to your phone. You can't turn to your shiny, glowing rectangle, that little abysmal parasite, that little comfort blanket, and check notifications, or go tweet something, or go watch a YouTube video. You're stuck with the thoughts that are rushing in. And the only way to deal with the thoughts that are rushing in is to quite literally deal with them, to think them through. You can't write anything down during this process either. So you have to spend time trying to work out how you're going to catalog this memory or this thought that's come to your mind, and you begin to work stuff out simply because there's no interruption. And it was so shocking and frightening to me that this process felt new to me. Yeah, of course there was a time before the phones, and I wonder if that's the thing that we find so appealing, the ability to have a train of thought. You and I, we're around 30 years old each. There was a time where, before the Nokia 3310, there was a time where we didn't have these devices. We were able to grok and play in reality, create our own little fictions, but with our friends and in a community. And I always want to be careful to say that, that time was better, because certainly without the phone, I wouldn't be able to do what I do. I wouldn't be able to have a job. I wouldn't be able to pay my rent without these digital devices and the ability to do this podcast. But equally, it does feel like, and again, as Douglas Copeland say, it does feel like I really miss my pre-internet brain.
Yeah. And I feel that. I mean, I think a lot of people who, lived that divide, like what you might call like digital migrants, but even some natives, like, who can just imagine what it must have been like pre-smartphone era. And, to some extent, each like context in which there's like a dominant technological thing, like the TV or whatever, there's always this, I remember, back, I missed the brain, my pre-TV brain or whatever, my and that's normal. It doesn't mean that's not to say that all the media change is the same. It's not true. But I definitely feel that. And I think that, I think it's important to have some distance from devices that you're tethered to all the time. And I think it's normal to yearn for some time away from them. I think that my issue with it is when it gets prescribed as like that's the solution for everybody. That's just what we got to do.
Correct.
And it puts the burden of behavior change then on all of us, when it's like, I can't help that, like you said, like I can't help that I had that anxiety and whatever, because I mean, that's your job. That's how you grow the podcast and whatnot. It's unfortunate, but it's true. And so, yeah, I'm in support of people, having a healthy relationship with their devices, even if that means occasionally kind of getting off to try to get their head straight, to have another train of thought, a unique train of thought, as you say. But the idea that that's the way that you solve the attention economy or something, it's just not true. And unfortunately, it's a really popular solution thanks to The Social Dilemma, where they essentially like argue for that. And they say, if we all put our phones down, it's akin to pressing a button and having the whole thing disappear, the whole big tech disappear. And we just know that that's just like not true at all.
Well, the thing that scares me, Grafton, and following you on Twitter and having some interactions with you through there, I know it scares you too, is the fact that it's big tech that's offering solutions to the problems that big tech created in the first place. And that's best captured by the idea of the wellness industry. The wellness industry is a $1 billion market suddenly created from a problem that big tech created in the first place. The wellness industry is the thing that's going to give us back our mind and our memories. And we get these meditation apps and Calm and Headspace, and Headspace did this painful Netflix documentary, this painful Netflix series. But again, it's all about using digital technology to sort of get us to the place before digital technology. It's like they have to be there regardless. The wellness industry is selling us the wellness we would have had if it wasn't for those buggers in the first place.
Yeah. I think that was my initial problem with the Social Dilemma guys, which their thing is called the Center for Humane Tech. It used to be called Time Well Spent. Now they're like the Social Dilemma guys, but whatever. That same group of people. That's my initial problem with them, is that, I just from a I don't know, like an ethical standpoint or something, I didn't want to take their solutions because they were the ones who kind of like helped create the problem, if you will. But then of course the solutions themselves are tech solutions to tech problems. And even though that it's not completely made explicit in the Social Dilemma, if you dig around a little bit on their website, the Center for Humane Tech, and read some of the stuff that those guys have written about how the utopias that they can consider, the ones that they dream up, like this is the perfect world we want to live in. And I think, what's his name? Justin Rosenstein. I think he wrote this kind of treatment of like what the future would look like, post big tech or whatever. And it is like a digital utopia. There's no indication that it would be any different than the attention economy that we're in right now. There's nothing about like the environmental costs of living in such a digital utopia, or who's going to moderate it, and blah blah blah, and who's going to make these things and devices. There is a supply chain here. They don't just show up out of the sky. They're made under exploitative means, and so that's a major issue. And you know what? They see tech solutions to tech problems because it's their narrow, very STEM tech focused worldview that they have, and it's like everything is through that lens.
Well, in that case, and I mean it's the core sadness, I guess, in the book is if we spend all our time focused on nostalgia, if we spend all our time living in the past, it becomes increasingly difficult to embrace and to think about the future. If all of our narratives and all the narratives that we really care about exist at a time before the present, then it really problematizes how we choose to think about the future. And when folk do think about the future, they can often be dismissed as naive utopians. This idea that tomorrow is going to be so much better than today. Again, this kind of American 60s version of the future. But as you so beautifully say, the only way to create a livable future is by creating the circumstances in the present that can breathe those futures. So what is it that we do right now for us to not just have a relationship with the past, but to have an honest and authentic and creative relationship with the future?
I think it starts, like I said, with not necessarily suppressing nostalgia or trying to excise it out of the situation. I think that also is a very privileged thing to say, to tell someone to not feel nostalgic. I mean, like, imagine telling that, everything we've gone through in the past year, and to be like, oh, just suck it up and, deal with the pandemic, deal with your feelings. No, that's, because you're right. That starts to kind of veer into this sort of techno-utopianism that the future is always better. I mean, like we can have hope for the future. It does require work in the present. And to be able to do that, we do have to rely on the past. And it's not necessarily something we could write off, forever. I think that in terms of directing nostalgia, being able to have a more radical kind of nostalgia that looks back to, and does it, I guess yearns for parts of the past in which there was collective action against, capitalism or what have you, the march of state and corporate powers against regular people. I think is an important use of the emotion. And, if there are times when nostalgia isn't an appropriate emotion to use, and it's not an appropriate emotion to use, it's the same thing with anger. Sometimes, anger is very useful when we use it in the right way, like, the protests of 2020 or fighting for the rights of regular normal people against, the powers that be, if you will. Other times anger is not very useful at all. Same thing with nostalgia. That's part of it, In terms of a wider tech critique, I think it's important that the conversation about tech has to go beyond the micro level, which is, the individual psychological effects of big tech. I think they're important, but it's got to go beyond that. It can't even go to like the middle level, the meso level, like, politics and things like this, and it's got to go all the way to the top. You've got to be able to have conversations in the mainstream about how big tech is capitalism and that it doesn't exist separate from it. It's not a solution to capitalism. It's not an aberration. It's just capitalism doing its thing. I think we're going to be looking at we're going to be faced with two very dominant discourses about big tech and trying to solve the problems of big tech, I think, in the next decade. On the one hand, you're going to have the social dilemma guys who are going to advocate for their version of an attention economy that's going to be like, it's not Mark Zuckerberg, he's the bad guy, trust me and trust my attention economy. It's going to be tech doing the work for you as opposed to tech being against you. We know that there are problems with that. And then I think the other tech critique you're going to see over the next 10 years is what I call like the right-wing tech critique, which you're already starting to see in the wake of Trump being deplatformed, which is conservatives saying that big tech squashes free speech and that it's this evil dominant thing that is going to take away our rights to be able to say what we want to say. And we have to come up with other discourses. Plenty of people are doing the work on this, but those other two are very dominant. Why? Because then you could critique big tech without having to critique things like capitalism and the exploitation of capitalist labor, which can be kind of difficult. And doing so might call out some of these people and their interests that they have, that if they were to be too critical of capitalism, they might be out of a job.
Well, I guess what I'm trying to get at, Grafton, is there an equivalent emotion to nostalgia that doesn't focus on the past but focuses on the future, an emotion that we can leverage right now in the present that will allow us to move towards the sorts of positive solutions that you're suggesting?
I think it's hope. I know Chris Hedges has written about hope. He said hope is different than optimism. Optimism is sort of what you get sold by corporate powers to just like pull up your bootstraps and just kind of like go along with it. But I think a radical kind of hope is extremely important to have, and is one in which there is some reliance on the past, because there's no way to hope and then therefore fight for a better future if you don't have any kind of grasp on how the previous social and collective movements of history helped to sort of time and again fight off major capitalist problems. This is something I think Naomi Klein has also written about brilliantly. She wrote, This Changes Everything about climate catastrophe just a few years back. And she writes about, it's going to seem like that climate warming is so bad, there's nothing we can do, and that we just have to sort of hate ourselves for being humans and destroying the world and basically just hold on, it's going to be a bumpy ride. But she says it's just not, it's not a good thing to do. Instead, you have to sort of look back to the past and see how other people did it when they were fighting off these major problems of modernity and exploitative capitalism, and then sort of fight for the future with the hope that even if you do it for a lifetime, it's like, that's what you have to do.
Well, Grafton, Tanner, our conversation has made me feel just a little bit more hopeful, and I just want to thank you for being on the Futures podcast.
Well, thank you for having me.
Thank you to Grafton for revealing how nostalgia functions in modern Western culture. You can find out more by purchasing his new book, The Circle of the Snake, Nostalgia and Utopia in the Age of Big Tech, available now. If you like what you've heard, then you can subscribe for our latest episode. Or follow us on Twitter, Facebook, or Instagram at Futures Podcast. More episodes, transcripts, and show notes can be found at futurespodcast.net. Thank you for listening to the Futures Podcast.